Welcome back to Reality Check Radio. You are listening to the Chantelle Baker Show. Yesterday, the long-awaited IPCA report came out about the police handling of the protest at Parliament from February to March in 2022. And if you don't know, the IPCA stands for Independent Police Conduct Authority. And that's exactly what this report is supposed to be, independent. And I'm not going to challenge that. Apparently, this is not a case of the police getting their mates to cover for them, so I take them at their word. And with that in mind, myself and my team have spent the last 24 hours reading, digesting, noting, and sometimes even laughing at what we've read. And I say laughing because I was there and I live streamed much of the protest. And there were others too who recorded as much of it as they could. And over time, these recordings might tell a very different story. The IPCA paints an alarming picture of terrified police officers fighting a deadly battle against a horde of murderous protesters, armed only with laws that prevented them from defending themselves adequately. But what I saw was something very different. And in time, I do believe that that story will come out as well. And that unlike this IPCA report tries to make out, the protesters were peaceful. And the only times anger spilled out, it was due to police involvement. And outside those rare occasions that happened, for the vast majority of the 23 days, the protesters stood and listened to speakers, sang songs, shared stories, people prayed in both Māori and English, Hare Krishnas chanted, everyone ate together, did yoga together, they set up a kids' skate camp, they had teachers. It was a very different time. So what I'm trying to say is that while you can write the word independent on the cover of an official report and you can fill it in with all of the selected truths and facts you want, yep, that's one version of what happened and that's their version and that's fine. It's their voice, the voice of officialdom, but it is only half of the story. What is missing, as always in this story, is the voices of the people. The citizens of New Zealand who are so affected by the events of 2020 to 2022 that they uprooted their lives and went to camp on the lawns of Parliament in an attempt to have their voices heard. And you can say this report is independent, but what you can't say is this report gives the people the voice they attempted to have heard. And that's just a continuation of how this whole sorry affair has come to pass. One side gets their story told and the other doesn't. So today, here on Reality Check Radio, we'll talk about the report and we'll give voice to those so-called independent voices so no one can claim we're not objective. And we're also going to turn the microphone over to the unheard voices to hear the stories of some of the people who are there, who, yet again, have been ignored.
If you wanted an illustration of just what it did to people, we were in this truck and this guy, who was a Wellingtonian, just came and he was drawn to just look out for us. He would say, well, what do you need? Then he'd come back the next day with all these battery packs or with games for the children or everything really. You know, he said how it made a big transformation in his life. The people there were just an extraordinary mix of New Zealanders. We were so different from each other and yet we had this common purpose. And we were united in that in a way that it's very hard to feel that sort of unity in regular daily life.
But on top of that, people, look at the environment that we have created here, an environment of aroha. Somebody say aroha. Do you know what aroha means? It means love. We've created that environment here. On top of that, we've created an environment of whakawhanaungatanga. Whakawhanaungatanga means supporting one another, despite your differences, your belief or your culture. Then on top of that, manaakitanga. Somebody say manaakitanga. Manaakitanga means we are all the same. We can work together in unity.
The clip you just heard is a clip from the upcoming documentary film about the Wellington protests. We Came Here for Freedom, made by my producer Alistair Harding, an incredibly talented filmmaker. Alistair, thank you for hanging out with me. Join the show.
Thanks for having me, Chantelle. As always, this is a really interesting subject, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we were there, we saw it all happen ourselves, and then to see it written in this official version is is a little bit surreal in some ways, isn't it?
There's just some parts in there that I was floored by. I think they took it to a level that I did not expect, and don't know if that's my naivety or that's just my trust in New Zealand people wanting to be decent human beings and find resolution first. But we'll get into that throughout this show. But yeah, there's some parts in there which I had to read 3-4 times to fully understand what they were saying.
I think this report tells a completely different story to what my memories of the whole event were like. I remember a very loving, inclusive place where people were getting their voices heard. What this report tells is a story about, in some places they're talking about us like we were a murderous horde. And that's just completely at odds with what I remember. Now, I suppose we have to be objective about this, and we have to realize that, there was fear on that side just as there was fear on our side. I mean, I remember distinctly feeling fear about the police actions on a number of occasions. And I suppose what this report shows is that they felt fear on their side as well. But I find it very hard to accept that they felt that fear because we weren't armed. All we were doing was singing songs and listening to speakers and having hug breaks.
But I think that depends on where you're talking about in the protest, right? Because from your examples, you're talking about the vast majority of the protest, but they are really only looking at the last day. And so that's what this IPCA report sometimes glosses over a little bit. They're actually really only looking at footage and photos of the last day. So the parliamentary CCTV footage, they never requested that in time. The police didn't request it from Parliament in time, so it was overwritten. So they actually never looked at any of the footage of the protest during that time frame, during the full 22 days. They only looked at it on the last day, the 23rd. So if you're looking at it objectively, and as we all believe, there were some people there that seems like they just popped up on the day because they wanted a bit of a scrap with police and they weren't necessarily people that actually cared about the mandates. They just were there for their own reasons. If you just look at that very last day in that perspective, then this IPCA report probably makes more sense. And if you also look at the fact that they took out any instance of assault against the protesters and they claim that those are in their own independent investigations. So if you take out any instances where the police acted aggressively, and then you also take into account this, they only looked at the final day, then that's the context of this report.
I don't think they're looking at only the final day here. They do talk about February the 10th. They do talk about other instances.
Yeah, but the vast majority is of that final day. They're not going through saying, oh, they were peaceful and everything was wonderful on this day and this day and this day and this day. They're just talking about instances of any aggression. And even on that first day, you can't say the protesters were aggressive back because that just did not happen. And so the vast majority of the time where they're talking about any aggression, they're just talking about that final day. But you're right, there are a couple of instances they refer to, like the feces being thrown. And again, we've done OIA reports to try and find like lab results or anything of this kind. And there's other OIAs people have put in, and none of that has been given to the public. So at this stage, we're purely taking the police's word that they said something. And I mean, it's interesting because some of these things started out as there was an unknown liquid, then it changed to it could have been urine, then apparently in this report it's feces. So it just seems over the year to have morphed into something different every single time they're questioned about it, which I find unusual if they're not willing to give up the lab results or the police reports and actually give us a bit more detail about what these substances were.
Yeah, and I think to me that's a lot of what we're reading in this report is basically just a justification of how the police handled things. There was no, when you look through it, you realize that there wasn't really much emphasis put on negotiation. They didn't really want to talk about things. All they wanted to do was clear people out, and that was their approach. I do think that a lot of the way that they use language here and the stories that they tell the story from the police side, and when it comes to when they have to tell the story of where the protesters were or what the protesters were thinking or what the protesters think about these things, they're not very sympathetic, whereas they're very sympathetic on the police side. And this is where I find it interesting, because when you read through the report, it does sound like the protesters were a murderous bunch. And you listen to some of this very emotional language. For example, on page 199 of the report, there's a quote from a police officer, and it says, I quote, "I believed I was going to watch a cop get killed that day. That was my viewpoint. I vividly recall thinking, I asked through the radio for approval to deploy the 40mm sponge round with words to the effect, 'We are losing this battle. We need to change the momentum, turn the tide.' I recall requesting that on 3, possibly 4 occasions." You know, this really does paint this picture of them being in this battle where they were under attack. And my memories of the whole occupation were never of protesters attacking the police. This paints a completely different picture to what he's talking about. This police person is talking about, I believed I was going to watch a cop get killed that day. Did you ever feel like your life was in danger or a policeman's life was in danger during that protest?
No, I definitely didn't feel like there was any policeman lives in danger. I mean, you had people at one stage throwing bits of 2x4, and I ran in to try and stop them. And you can say that's incredibly dangerous, right? But you also have to remember that the police all had shields, had gloves, had elbow pads, had knee pads. Like, they were fully padded up. They had big shields, they had big helmets, they had the whole lot. And I'm not justifying anyone throwing anything ever, because I think that's really wrong, and I completely disagree with that. But in terms of deadly force, no, because you have to keep in mind they were also throwing them from miles away from any of the officers. So they'd lost kind of all velocity by the time they got to them. They talk about the paving bricks, and I'm sure that would have been scary. But then the police started throwing them back at protesters, giving them back the ammunition. And also the protesters had no kind of padding, didn't have helmets. So in terms of deadly force, that was a lot more deadly towards the protesters than anything that the protesters could achieve back to the police's side. But I think what I found most interesting about all of this, and most concerning about all of this, was when they're talking in this report about the use of firearms. Because this report talks about how Jacinda Ardern had decided very early on she was not going to talk with any protesters, no matter how small the group was, because earlier in the year people had turned up to events she was talking at and yelled at her, protested against her. So because of these small groups of people that turned up to events, she decided that she wasn't going to talk to any of the tens of thousands of people that turned up during the Parliament protest. So she had decided she wasn't going to talk to anyone, and so therefore the police report says that de-escalation, they said we're going to try to do de-escalation, but around the use of firearms, at one stage they talk about how a managed retreat is not an option, and then they talk about the use of firearms. So they were more happy for it to escalate to a point that firearms could be needed to be used against people than for the Prime Minister to have a conversation with people she didn't want to. And if that's not the epitome of deep-rooted narcissism, I have no idea what is.
Yeah, and I think backing up that, one of the other things that I noticed in this report was when they give a timeline of the events and how the police reacted to each of the things that happened. One of the things that I noticed straight away was that the protesters arrived on February the 8th. On February the 9th, the police came in the first time. You see that in my film, We Came Here for Freedom, Part 1, where the police came in and they stood in a line at the top of the steps, and it caused a little bit of chaos, but then everybody calmed down a little bit. And then the next morning, on February the 10th, on I believe it was a Thursday, the police came in and tried to clear everybody off. And so then when you keep looking through the timeline, you go down a couple more days. It's not until February the 13th that they actually decide to start negotiating, that they actually start to try and open a dialogue with the protesters. To me, that sounds like it's just arrogance, is it not? To have a bunch of people turn up, uproot their lives, and drive to Wellington to camp on the lawns because they've got nothing better to do than to fight for something they truly believe in. And the government and the police didn't decide until February the 13th that they would actually want to speak and find out what the protesters wanted. And that to me is the root cause, of the root problem of all of this, is that there's never been an attempt to discuss anything with the protesters. And even in this report, it seems like the protesters are they're not really worth listening to. And we'll go through a few of those examples as we go through. But it also seems to the report seems to just justify a lot of quite appalling police behaviour. And in that, we talk about at point 112 there, they talk about 8 of the 28 incidents that happened during the event. The IPCA believed that they didn't necessarily have to talk about these incidences because they're ongoing investigations, but they're really quite horrible examples of police conduct, aren't they?
Yeah, and this is what I find interesting. So if you take out any examples of the police brutality, especially the force of brutality, then you also take out any of the context of the longevity of the protest, then of course you're left with a report that makes it seem glowing in terms of the police behaviour. So that's what I did find really interesting. They've kind of excluded any mass events against the protesters and then made sure that every event against a police officer was exemplified. And in here it's interesting because it does say on the final day there was not one police officer that was hospitalised. So, and I'm not saying that that's a justification for use of force, because I think that's, basing any violence on if people are in hospital or not is not wonderful. But I am saying that a cut on the head or the hand is very, very different to being hospitalised, and a number of the protesters were hospitalised. So you've got to look at this in a little bit of context as well. They're saying they're scared for their lives, yet protesters had much more reason to be scared for theirs.
Yeah, and some of these points that I'm looking at here in point 112, punched an elderly man in the face who was attempting to protect another protester from them. Eye gouged a man. I'll come back to that in a moment. Grabbed a man seated on a bollard and pulled him to the ground by the neck. Fractured a woman's sternum while she was standing in front of the police skirmish line. Placed a man in a headlock and dragged him along the ground by his neck and ear. Struck a woman in the face with a shield, breaking several of her teeth. And I just want to go back to that line, eye gouged a man. One compound word and 2 normal words to describe one of the most horrific things I've ever seen happen. And it was all filmed by the media. It was on television. And yet this is the extent that they're going to talk about it. That was extreme police misconduct at the high end.
Yeah, and that was far before that last day as well. So that was just some random day. I think, wasn't it when it was that they tried to come in and take the toilets, or something was happening around the toilet block, and that's when he got eye gouged, and obviously eye gouged. He was punched in the face repeatedly, massive black eyes, bruises all over his face, and eye gouged. And so if they choose to take the instances like that happened throughout the protests out of this report, I mean, you're going to be left with a one-sided view, and that's what this is.
Yeah, and I think that's my main complaint with this. It seemed the whole report seems to justify everything by actually glossing over something like this. We've got a really high-end example of police misconduct, and it gets 3 words put to it. That's it. And so, of course, everything after that is going to sound like it's fine. Oh, yeah, it was justified what they did. This was a murderous bunch. Of course, we all felt in fear for our lives. But hold on, how did Phil, just for listeners who don't know, that was a man named Phil. He got pushed up against some portaloos and eye gouged. It was around February 22nd, I think, somewhere around there. And he ended up with massive black eyes. I've got that in the film We Came Here for Freedom as well. You can see the results of what happened. Yet, this just gets glossed over completely. So
I can't help but think how they would have described that if it was a protester that had done it to police. They would have put in a line, I thought I was going blind. I thought I'd lose my vision forever. Like they would dramatize it endlessly if it was on the police side. But because it was on the protester side, it says, well, this guy got eye gouged, but who really cares? That leads us to our next interview, which I think you will all really love listening to. Sue Gray was a prominent voice at the Parliament protest, and her partner Alan had his hip broken by the New Zealand police. All right, Sue, thank you so much for joining me to talk through the IPCA report here on ICR. I really appreciate you giving me your time.
Oh, thank you, Chantelle. It's my privilege to talk to you.
What were your initial thoughts reading through this report? Because I know you've had a bit of a read through. And so what was your initial thoughts when you started reading? Do you think it's really accurate? Do you think it's fair? Do you think it's biased? How do you see this situation as a lawyer?
Well, my first impression was actually it was a complete whitewash. I was extremely disappointed, and especially because it seemed to sort of have a lot of minor detail, but it didn't really answer some of the really big questions that I was more interested in, such as the Bill of Rights type questions.
Okay, so when we go down into this and we start talking about specific isolated incidents and they say things like the COVID numbers were up, your partner Alan had a situation at the hospital with them stating that he was a COVID case when he wasn't sure that he was. Can you talk to me about what happened with that?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I can't even find any reference to Alan in this IPCA report, even though Alan and I both spoke to them. We sent them a huge amount of information, and yet there's just nowhere so far that I've been able to find a mention. What happened on the day was we were staying in a camper van in a legal park in Aitken Street, and we heard a helicopter around 6 a.m, so we went out to have a look. We both took our cameras, started live streaming everything we could do, walked up Hill Street slightly, saw a wave of police coming down the street with their shields and helmets and whatever on. It was quite confusing at the time, and I didn't see where Alan went. I sort of went over on the side of the street, and then the police just basically pushed people out of the way. I watched so many people getting pushed and shoved, and I got pushed and shoved myself. And then probably half an hour later, I got a call from Alan to say he'd been pushed over and couldn't walk anymore. And so it took me about half an hour or more to actually get around, because I had to go all the way around the block to get around to where he was and find him sitting in a wheelchair waiting for an ambulance, where he waited and waited and waited for about 4 hours in total before he got an ambulance. And then when we finally got to Wellington Hospital, they did a COVID test on him, and they said that he was positive for COVID. So he was in isolation for the next 7 days while he was getting a replacement hip as a result of the police assault. Now, none of that seems to have found its way into this report.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's some things that are omitted from this?
Oh, I can only speculate. They did write to me, because as a lawyer, I wrote to the Police Complaints Authority on behalf of 3 people quite early on. One was Alan, one was Portaloo Phil, and one was the journalist who I personally observed and videoed being assaulted by the police. And with each of their consent, I wrote and made a complaint. And I got an email back at one stage saying no, they weren't going to be looking at any individual complaints. They were only going to be looking at overall police conduct, and that they wouldn't be investigating specific complaints any further. So I thought, well, I understood they had a lot of complaints, but I thought that was pretty poor when 2 of those complaints involved very serious injuries, and the third one with the journalist involved basically interference in a person collecting evidence that may be required for future court proceedings. So that was serious in my view in a different way. As far as I can find, they haven't addressed any of those. So they just sort of drew a line and excluded a whole lot of important information.
Do you think they made an effort to understand why the protesters were there, or do you think that doesn't fall into what they were trying to achieve, which is simply to look at the police's use of authority?
Yeah, I had quite a good conversation with the woman who was investigating my complaints, and I actually emailed her at one stage and said, look, can you please assure me that this is going to be a genuine inquiry, because if it's not, then I'm not prepared to waste my time. But if it is a genuine inquiry, I'm prepared to assist you as much as I can. And she came back saying, oh no, it's absolutely a genuine inquiry. So, and we did talk about, with her, I think she was very interested. We talked about a whole lot of the background. We talked about a meeting that a group of us had arranged with the police the day before this, what I call a riot, occurred on the 2nd of March. So on the 1st of March, we had a meeting scheduled with some senior police at 1:30. At 1:25, the police cancelled that meeting. We had a really good discussion about all sorts of things, including the Bill of Rights issues, the mandates, why people had felt the need to go to Wellington. And yet, this all seems to be just ignored unless it's hiding in some subsection that I haven't found yet.
So did you see any of the write-up of your details of that meeting? Did you see any of that or not yet?
I haven't found any of that so far, at least.
Okay, because I did see a section where they had written about one meeting, but they effectively tried to say that the Deputy Police Commissioner had done it without other members being notified. So it seemed to me like they thought there might have actually been something to that meeting, but they wanted to make it clear that he did it kind of his own volition.
Well, we didn't have the meeting because we all went together at a room for a Zoom call, and at 5 minutes before the meeting, the police emailed back to say it was cancelled. So that was the main meeting I was going to attend. Actually, on I think it was the second day of the protest, the first day that there was any police presence, I actually introduced myself to one of the police officers and said, hey, I'm co-leader of the Outdoors Party. I'm a lawyer. I know a lot of the people here from different events. If you want to do any liaison, I'm really, really happy to talk to you. And I was never, ever approached during the whole time. I spoke to quite a few other police at different times, usually on the sort of bollards that they'd put around the barriers of the location. Again, I offered to help with anything, never any sort of interest at all. So I don't actually think they were trying to engage at all.
Do you think it's right, their assessment of the dangers and of the level of violence of the protesters?
Completely wrong. The only time I ever saw any violence at the protest was when the police were there, and much of that violence was instigated by the police. From the very first day, it was incredibly peaceful and people were just happy to get together and be there. On the first day, there were no police, and I actually wanted to go to the toilet, and I walked up to Parliament to the door where we'd normally go in and make submissions to the Select Committee, and I asked the security guard if I could please go inside and use the toilet. And he looked a bit sheepish and embarrassed and said, oh, look, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to let anybody in. So I ended up going down to the railway station instead. But, that was the thing. When there was no police presence, the atmosphere was really, really good. It was only when the police came storming in large numbers and pushing and shoving people that obviously some people got a bit hot, heated up. But then the other thing that happened on that last day was there were clearly infiltrators in the crowd, and I've was at the hospital with Alan for much of the day, but I've seen the videos of those group of people with the bandanas across their face. I've seen the screenshots of Antifa congratulating themselves for causing so much trouble. And I don't believe that what I call the third group at the protest, so first there were the genuine protesters, then there were the police, but the third group were the Antifa / intentional troublemakers. They were not part of the protest, and yet they were, it seems, largely the people who intentionally caused trouble on the last day.
There's been a lot of discussion in the media around how they were upset at the use of language by the protesters and some of the signs that the protesters had calling for Jacinda to be hung and things like that. What is your take on that situation?
Look, I didn't see those signs. There were a huge amount of signs, but almost everything I saw was quite sort of peace and love type of attitude. Of course, some people were unhappy because they'd lost their career. Some people had lost their homes. Their family members were distraught that I remember signs from little kids that couldn't go to their ballet lessons or sports anymore. But if there were any stronger signs, then they're using them to make a fuss. Actually harden up and do your job. And if there's the occasional protester that's causing trouble, well, let's deal with the occasional protester, but let's not lump everybody under one category, because the people I met were doctors, teachers, nurses, correction staff, defence force staff, quite a few police themselves. There were journalists who were after hours during the day reporting the government narrative, after hours coming down and enjoying the lovely vibe at the protest. There were all sorts of people there. There were lots of people from Wellington, friends of mine who'd come down every night after work because it was so much fun and such a great place to be, and it was basically the only party sort of atmosphere in town. There were just so many good, normal people down there, and it's just a big excuse for them to not engage. And the other thing is the government said they weren't engaging because we stayed overnight. Well, they could have engaged on the first day. They could have engaged when we went on to other protests previously where people just stayed for a few hours and then went home, but they never engaged at any of those protests either. It was, again, in my view, just an excuse.
Hey, Sue, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to hearing more of your thoughts as time goes by and as we all have time to kind of go through this IPCA report in great detail. Thank you so much for coming on with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Chantelle. It's my privilege to be talking to you, and any time, very happy to help.
They had a definite way that they wanted to portray those at the protest and to twist things to such a point that it appeared that way in their narrative.
You know, they were calling us the river of filth, you know, white supremacists, about everything under the sun, just to try and make us look bad, trying to tell us that there was rubbish everywhere and trying to say that people were flushing their toilet compartments into the middle of the streets and into the sea, which definitely wasn't true.
They were saying some nasty things, you know, things like you can't walk through there with a mask because you will get harassed. And so I put that to the test and I walked through Parliament and all I got was people looking at me smiling. I was really disappointed. I was hoping that someone would have a go at me so I could turn around and then say, you are the type of person that mainstream media is zoning in on and making us look bad. You need a different approach. But it never happened.
Yeah, when we talk reporting, I mean, the other really interesting part was the helicopter trip. Someone had offered to sponsor a helicopter so Chantelle could do a flyover both what was happening in Wellington and what was happening in Picton. So they did the flyover of the Wellington protest and then they landed to change choppers to go over to Picton, and basically the pilot got told, no, you're not. You know, we've got the disinformation project that goes around saying, oh, these are all misinformation people. Well, actually, that we were stopped from people getting all the information themselves. Government officials would not allow the people in New Zealand to see the whole story.
The helicopter pilot has just had a call from the senior sergeant of the police requesting that we no longer fly. Why are they not wanting to show what's really going on there? I'm asking you, Senior Sergeant, what are you trying to suppress?
We use the term gaslighting, but to me it was even more malicious than that. There was that case with Phil being eye gouged. It's quite obvious to see how that went down, yet it was portrayed by the media that it was his fault. Well, if standing there voicing your opinion justifies a police officer going for your eyes, it's disturbing. I mean, for an officer to do such an act like that, that is filth. It's very hard to rationalise that with how the media portrayed that. Where's the news reporting on when things haven't gone right from the police side of it? Why is that being kept suppressed?
It's such a powerful documentary. I've seen a first run at it and you will all be absolutely blown away by the amount of time and effort and just incredible examples of the detail of what really went on at the protest. So you can watch that on operationpeople.com. We came here for freedom. There's one side of this, the story about the protesters being peaceful and loving, which is our side. And when the police came in, there was a feeling of oppression. People talk a lot about the feeling that they were living in a police state, that they felt powerless against this sort of machine. All the police were masked. They didn't talk to you, explain to you what they were doing. But on the other side, this report almost talks as if they were so hamstrung by out-of-date laws, under-equipped and overwhelmed by a superior force that they were forced to resort to what they called weapons of opportunity, which to them were the fire extinguishers, water hoses, and paving bricks. And the report describes it as an object or substance taken from the immediate environment for use in self-defense or defense of another when no other appropriate and approved tactical option is accessible or available. And actually, I want to talk about this for a second, just this notion of self-defense. The protesters were standing there in the field and on the Parliament grounds like they had been doing every single day. They weren't trying to kick over the fences to run towards Parliament buildings. They weren't trying to break into areas. They were just standing on the grounds asking to be listened to. So for the police to come in and start attacking people, pushing them over, hitting them, destroying all of their property, and then call it self-defense is absurd. It's not true. They were attacking the people that they wanted to get rid of. That's the reality of the situation. Then they wanted to use weapons of opportunity to further their goal. And I did find it interesting in the report. They mentioned myself and my film crew, but they just called us protesters. They said how we were up on the pillar, and that's part of a separate investigation when we were sprayed by multiple police officers with fire extinguishers. Now, in another ruling, a judge had, I think it was a Judge Smith, but I'll have to double check that, against a man who sprayed fire extinguisher at the police officers. The judge called it a harmful substance that can be toxic if ingested, and it can cause egregious harm, and it was an egregious use of this fire extinguisher. Now, the police report doesn't mention that we were held hostage up on this pillar. We were just filming, that's all we were doing. I believe a lot of them knew who I was. And they held 3 different fire extinguishers on us as we were up on this pole, so we couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't get down because you can't see if it's safe and there's spiked steel fence all around you. So you can't jump down, it wasn't safe, and they would not stop. And we were screaming at them to let us get down, to stop so we could get down. After that incident, I had this horrible cough. I was coughing up this white, mucousy, horrible stuff for nearly a month afterwards. My face was all swollen. I had rashes. It was awful. And at the end of that day, we actually ended up having to drive and get driven straight to the sea to jump off and to try and get that all out of our clothes, out of our hair, and we just jumped straight in the sea to try and get it off because it was itchy and horrible. And I was endlessly coughing. It was awful. So they just took out instances like that because that was an egregious use of harm, an egregious use of that. And so rather than putting that in the report, they even had a photo in there that shows the police officer, or one of them, holding a fire extinguisher, but down low. So you can't actually see that they were spraying us on that fence. They just cherry-picked a photo that worked better for this report. And I found that really interesting.
Yeah, and you see this very, very clearly, Chantelle, in the film, where you had you up there on top, Jake was up there with you. There was also, I was filming from further back. I didn't actually realise at the time because there was so much fire extinguisher smoke all around that I couldn't actually see you guys, but I happened to be filming that way. And then there was Lingo Louie. He was up on the other pillar on the other side of the gate. He was filming the same thing. So we've got about 3 or 4 angles of the same event happening. And all you're doing is standing up there. Now, in the report, they talk about the use of fire extinguishers in that instance of them firing through that gate with the fire extinguishers. And they're saying their excuse is that people were standing there throwing stuff at the backs of police. At that time, the police had advanced past the gates on the inside of the Parliament grounds. Now, this is completely untrue. As I said, I was filming it. I've actually got footage of that happening. And there were a couple of people near the gates, but there weren't many. It was only 1 or 2 because they were firing the fire extinguishers. But all those people were doing was just shouting at the police, and they certainly weren't throwing things. And you guys certainly weren't throwing things either. So to me, all this shows again is they're just trying to justify what the police did. Like you said, other people have actually been prosecuted for using a fire extinguisher against police. So in that case, I can't help but think that the law isn't being used equally in these cases. But again, they keep on talking about how all of these things, all these weapons of opportunity, so to speak, were all in self-defense. When, as you said right at the beginning, my memory of that day was that we were woken at 6 o'clock in the morning by police with shields and batons and helmets charging at us. There was only one aggressor on that day in my memory.
Yeah, I think there was one aggressor, but then people were riled up towards when they started fighting back. And that was true, and that did happen. And I think that this was interesting because we have an interview with Phil, and so we'll get to question him on what he thinks is an egregious use against the people, because he did group training, he did anti-riot training, he was a member of the SAS here in New Zealand, so he's military trained. So it's interesting to hear his perspective of how they handled the situation. Was it appropriate, and did they try to de-escalate, or were they trying to escalate? because you've got things like when they use the water hoses on the people. Now, I do think by that point, it almost seemed like it was a big free-for-all. You know, they were using whatever they could, and I get the sense that they really felt, particularly when the protesters started pulling up the pavement, and how they even did that, I've got no idea. I didn't even know people were strong enough they could pull up pavement. So I think we had largely exited the protest by that point. After we came down the stairs, I had a group of people try to attack me, essentially. So I exited the protest really quickly after that. I was covered in this dust and I couldn't breathe very well, and it was horrible. So I didn't go back in and see any of that. You couldn't get back in once you exited. So all I've got is really live streams and videos of what happened. But I get the feeling that the protesters or agitators, who knows, I think it could have been a mix of both, really did start to gain ground back on the police. I think the police were really seriously thinking about what do we do now, and they couldn't retreat because retreat would make our police force look absolutely pitiful in the eyes of other people who were believing the media and saying these protesters are terrible people. So they couldn't let the protesters win again. They had to shut it down, and they were prepared to do whatever necessary to make that happen.
One of those things that they believed was necessary, I have to laugh a little bit at this one, is the use of weapons of opportunity. And they're talking about bricks. So apparently they were having the bricks thrown at them, as you were talking about. And then a couple of the police officers in the report admit to throwing them back at the police. And I find this a little bit funny because they were they do talk about how they were scared for their lives. And I could imagine how if you get hit in the face by a brick or hit in the head, that you could get some real damage done to you. But I would think that you wouldn't want the protesters to have those bricks back so they could throw them at you again. But that's exactly what the police did. Apparently, they were picking them up and throwing them back at the protesters. I find that funny and also quite disturbing that the police, apparently being very, very professional, according to this report, thought that it was justified. And when you look through the findings of the report, all of these things, the IPCA report says everything was justified. On one of the pages here, use of force reporting, use of LRADs, justified. Use of skirmish lines and shields, justified. Use of empty hand tactics, that's when police were pushing and punching at the protesters, justified. Use of pepper spray, justified. Batons, justified. Weapons of opportunity, justified. All the way down, tire deflation, sponge rounds, carriage of firearms. Why on earth they thought that carrying firearms into that situation was a good idea, I'll never know.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that would be a really... But then when they say police officers justified in carrying firearms, you have the Armed Defenders Squad that was stationed there, but they were back from your frontline squad. So your frontline squad didn't have firearms on them, obviously, because if you're grappling with protesters, you wouldn't want anyone being able to grab a gun off you. That wouldn't really make sense. And so they had the Armed Defenders Squad, and the Armed Defenders Squad had asked to be able to use their firearms earlier. And this is what made me laugh. I did find this quite funny, but it just comes down to, again, they had this picture that the protesters were so dangerous, you know. So there was a pile of pipes that were in a bush near the university, and apparently someone said that they were guns. So the Armed Defenders Squad said, we need our guns, we need to be able to be armed because there's these pile of guns hidden in a bush. But it was just some pipe in a bush. So you would think that they would have a little bit more intelligence where they could send out someone undercover and they could just go and check what this was in the bush. But instead of doing that, they were like, we need guns. we need to be able to shoot people just in case. And I can understand that, because if you genuinely, if there were actually guns, then you can understand why they would want to make sure that the police weren't going to get shot, because I completely agree with that. I think that you don't want the use of firearms ever during a protest. That's absolutely absurd. But the fact that they were just pipes did just make me go, oh my goodness. And it's just another testament to the fact that they truly did believe that these protesters were, you know, the world's most dangerous people, and essentially this river of filth that they'd been hearing about on the TV all this time. But then we get to the next part, which is, were the arrests justified? So this is interesting, because the vast majority of protesters had all of their charges dropped. I know my father had his charges dropped. All of the girls that we have talked to had their charges dropped. It's interesting. It seems that the only people that really were charged were people that had prior convictions, which I can understand. And I remember Dad saying something, when I say Dad, I mean Leighton Baker, but I remember him saying something interesting. He said, out of everyone that was sitting there in the cells with him when he got arrested on that final day, they were all 50-year-old like dudes that had never been jailed before. And they looked around and they were going, how are we even here? You know, never been arrested or done anything wrong in their life, and yet you had a whole group of them that were arrested simply because they thought this was wrong and they were willing to go and sacrifice themselves for what they believed was the greater good, which was to say to the police, this is unacceptable and you cannot treat New Zealand citizens this badly, and refuse to talk with them and say that you'd rather assault them than have a conversation. So this gets me to the next part. The current findings. The current law governing arrest, and this is from the IPCA report, they say this: the current law governing arrest is not fit for purpose for the mass public disorder situation that confronted the police on the 2nd of March. But this really paints a picture of police ineptitude. They didn't negotiate with protesters until February the 13th, so they never talked about negotiation or dialogue seriously. So that was after they'd already come in and assaulted the protesters on the very first time. They hadn't even thought about negotiating with anybody. So they would rather come in, assault them, get rid of them, than have any sort of conversation right from the outset. And that mindset really did carry through until that final day. The February 10th attack was woefully inadequate. They should have gone harder, worse on the protesters that day. They were not armed enough for March the 10th. They needed those weapons of opportunity because those saved lives. The lack of training left them unable to face unarmed protesters who stood with their backs to the police. And on top of that, no apparent prosecution of officers for doing things like eye gouging, breaking any bones, sending people to hospital, and using toxic substances. So that gets us to the interview of Phil. Phil is ex-SAS. He's a member of the OP team, and he was working with us during the Parliament protest. And I wanted to get Phil's opinion of this from someone who has done anti-riot training, because I haven't. I don't know from the police's or military side what is acceptable and what isn't. So without further ado, Phil, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi Chantelle. Nice to be on the show.
So with your group police training, how were you taught to handle crowds?
Yeah, well, with the military, we did some riot control training and things like that, and also working in the counter-terrorist area. We actually, the role in counter-terrorism is we would get jobs handed over from police to us, and generally the police's strategy is a strategy of de-escalation, because they want to walk away with a peaceful resolution, and so their job is to de-escalate rather than escalate things, as opposed to the role that I was in, which was we weren't too worried about. De-escalation and proportional use of force was something that we did, but we weren't as worried about trying to negotiate and come to peaceful resolution by the time it got to us. So that was sort of the contrast between sort of how the police handle things and how the military would then handle a domestic terrorist situation. And, from looking at the protest and this IPCA report, I guess I think this is very disappointing on the eve of Anzac Day, when we're going to be commemorating all those lives that were lost fighting against totalitarian regimes and against regimes like the Nazis that were taking away people's rights. And here we have this IPCA report. Essentially, when you read through the summary, and I haven't read the entire report, but what I've read so far is I'm getting the indication that they're advocating for to rewrite laws to allow the police to do this type of thing in the future. They're sort of saying, it's not very clear how we deal with this, and we need to allow them to be able to do this in the future, and so we need to write the laws to do that. Well, on the eve of Anzac Day, I think that is a very, very disappointing outcome from the report. I also don't think it's the report has accurately or has done a very good job of understanding the pre-protest picture of why the protesters were there. I mean, these protesters were there to fight for freedom. They were there to uphold the Bill of Rights, and we can see that throughout the pandemic. They'd actually taken a few sections of the Bill of Rights. They'd taken your right to refuse to undergo a medical treatment, and they'd taken your right to freedom of movement, and they'd actually sort of used these two as a bargaining chip. So they'd said, well, if you want to uphold your right to refuse to undergo a medical treatment, then you're going to have to sacrifice your right to freedom of movement. And if you sacrifice your right to, if you don't sacrifice your right to refuse to undergo a medical treatment, then you're going to lose your right to freedom of movement. And I think, that's what they were there for. They were there fighting to uphold our Bill of Rights. Now, I know Section 5 in the Bill of Rights sort of puts limits on that, but in reality, I think we did see a move towards removing rights, and I think this protest, one of the biggest in New Zealand probably, after perhaps maybe the Springbok tour, again, who were fighting for sort of equal rights. And yeah, right on the eve of Anzac Day, this just doesn't bode well for New Zealand, I think.
You talked earlier about de-escalation. Do you think the police tried to de-escalate the situation on that final day?
On the final day, no. I don't think there was any de-escalation. In fact, I think they did the opposite. There was a few inciting incidents. I think it was late morning / early afternoon. The police with the riot body armour, there was about 30 or 40 of them or so sitting on the Parliamentary Library stairs, and at one point they launched off the stairs and they just leapt over the barriers and they sort of ran through in a big raid using sort of a shock action tactic. And I think from that point on, from covering it that day with the camera, I did notice that really the tensions escalated, and then that's when you sort of had a lot of the you started to see the police starting to use fire extinguishers against people. They were using batons against people. And that's when really things escalated. It also did split the protesters onto sort of two fronts on either side of the fence of Parliament lawn. But yeah, I did find that at that stage they had completely abandoned any sort of de-escalation. I found it was disappointing that the politicians didn't come out as well. I would have thought that the police were working would have been working towards getting sort of at least an audience with the politicians to help de-escalate, and that it seems that they didn't really do that option. So yeah, really disappointing. I don't really see it as a de-escalation tactic. I actually thought that the police did the opposite, and they actually escalated throughout that final week to March the 2nd, and on March the 2nd there were several incidents that I would say were escalatory rather than de-escalation.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because they say, well, if the protesters just acted what they deemed legally and went home and just stopped camping out, then we could talk with them possibly. But they ignore the fact that there's been protest against these mandates for over a year prior to that, and every single one of them was ignored by the politicians.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point, actually. And I think, that they didn't actually take in that intelligence picture very well. The intelligence picture leading up to this does show a lot of protests against the mandates and things like that. It seems that they were more concerned about a few people that reported losing their rights because they couldn't move up and down Molesworth Street, a few local residents, when in reality, walking through there were school kids walking through there every day, and they were unhindered, and it seems that this report really sided with those locals a few locals, when you had thousands of New Zealanders that didn't want to take the vaccine and had become subject to these mandates and lost their rights because of that, and it failed to acknowledge that for thousands of Kiwis, they'd been since November they'd lost their rights, and and so I think the report was extremely biased and didn't take a very good view of the protesters, didn't take an unbiased view of the protesters and acknowledge their situation.
There's an interesting chapter here, and it's on page 40 and 41, and it's essentially a whole list of things that people said online could have potentially been part of the protest, and they're saying, no, we decided that none of these things happened. And one of this was did not use plainclothes officers or authorise, arrange or pay for anyone else to agitate protesters. Now, there were a number of undercover police officers that came and visited the protest on a daily basis, but obviously we won't know exactly what they said to different protesters. But it's interesting here because essentially they go through a huge list of things saying that the police definitely didn't do essentially anything wrong during the protest whatsoever. Do you think that the IPCA would have had access to all the information they needed, or do you think it's just a result of the police saying, no, that didn't happen, and so therefore the IPCA take them at their word?
I think a little bit of both. The IPCA in that report does note that the police didn't keep certain records of meetings and things like that. So it seems there's been a lot that's happened within that the police strategy side that hasn't even been recorded on paper. So what was said in a meeting is not necessarily doesn't necessarily get handed over to the IPCA, or there's no record, there's no paper trail of what happened in that meeting. Now, after being in the military, then I can understand that you could actually task some people without actually leaving a paper trail. So yeah, it's. I think they have probably taken them at their word. It looks to me that they have just completely trusted whatever the police have said, rather than sort of taking more of a critical perspective and said, well, perhaps have the police, they are taking that the police have just purely acted in good faith.
There's one other thing here that I would...
difference as well with the protesters as well. It seems that they are sort of biased towards the police side rather than taking sort of an impartial investigative approach.
And that's really concerning on a number of levels, because people were very upset that I had given a lot of our footage to the IPCA, but I said, no, we've got to trust the process and trust that even though it's still a government organisation, that they will be objective in their views, right? That's the position we took here at OP. We wanted to make sure that we tried to follow the right process and say, look, this is the information we have, and we trust that you guys will act on it with integrity and with balance. And unfortunately, this report has seemed to do the opposite of that. There was one other bullet point here that I found interesting, particularly concerning a lot of the discussions I've had with you and with other members that are still serving either in the military or in the police, and that is this. When they would come in every single night at different hours of the night, it absolutely seemed strategic because they were doing tiny moves that they didn't actually need to do, particularly in the early stages of the protest. Now, they have said this in the IPCA report. Police carried out a number of operational tasks, such as placement or repositioning of bollards, in the early hours of the morning to ensure minimal interference from protesters and reduce disruption to the general public and traffic, and not as a tactic to wear down the protesters. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I actually disagree with that. I absolutely disagree with that in the sense that, because it was such a pattern and it was every night, and some of the things that they did, just moving a bollard just slightly, or something like that was unnecessary, and to me it seemed more like it was a tactic. Now, that would be a tactic that I would have used had I been in a military sense, in combat or something overseas, it would be, you generally do stuff at night time under the cover of darkness. It keeps people on edge. It wears down morale, things like that. So by doing these sort of probing attacks, I think, it did actually change the morale of the protest. And I can't remember where I've seen that, but I have seen that somewhere else, that maybe the media or something did also notice that change as well. It was in about the last week of the protest when they started doing that. Morale really changed. And I think that was sort of, in part, that was escalatory as well, because it really, when you change the morale of people, when they're not getting sleep at night, when they're in fear that they're going to be attacked every night, they start becoming agitated, anxiety levels go up, and they sort of get a bit more short-tempered and short-fused. And I think we definitely did see that happen in the last week of that protest as a sort of progressive strategy towards that March 2nd clearance.
Do you think there's any way that the police wouldn't have known? Do you think there's any way that the police wouldn't have known the impact that was having on the mental space of the protesters?
No, I disagree, because that's also an interrogation tactic. So they would have known that, by giving people a lack of sleep and things like that, they break down a lot easier. I mean, if you look at Trevor Mallard's actions, they don't even say in there that the music Trevor Mallard played, or not that I've seen yet anyway, and I haven't read the entire report, so I'll make sure I qualify it with that. But from what I've read about the Trevor Mallard music, they just say Trevor Mallard brought some speakers out and played some music. Well, that's only part of the story, because the actual music he played was music that would play along on a recorder, and then it had out-of-tune notes. Now, when you play that type of thing, that is actually a tactic to bear people down as well, because you expect to hear a piece of music that flows, but by introducing that those notes, it would throw people off. And that type of thing, when it plays on loop like they had it playing, is designed to bear down on people. Now I've done resistance to interrogation training, and you do the same thing. So similar tactics like playing the sound of children crying and things like that are used. Playing the white noise and things like that continually, and tracks like what Trevor Mallard played are actually used as a strategy to try and break people down over time, because it's this repetitive nature, but there's something in it that is not quite right, and that one thing in there that's not quite right ends up sort of getting on your nerves, and the IPCA report seemed to miss this completely. So I think either they don't really know what they're doing, or it's just not a very good report. It's not very thorough.
Awesome. Hey, Phil, thank you so much for joining me and sharing with us your insight into the Independent Police Commission that happened during the Parliament protest. So we really appreciate your time, and we'll talk with you soon.
Awesome. Thanks very much.
So that's the police side of the story. We're going to take a break now, and after we come back, we're going to turn the microphone in the direction of the people who aren't in this report, the protesters. This is Reality Check Radio. You're listening to the Chantelle Baker Show. Here is a clip from upcoming documentary We Came Here for Freedom, produced by Alistair Harding from OperationPeople.com.
I think I'm just gutted because of what was destroyed.
To stand there and experience being pepper sprayed, having to put in earplugs because of the sound waves they were using, it was scary. You couldn't even believe it was reality.
You know, they had a job to do. I'm not saying they didn't, and it was finishing that day one way or the other. But it broke my heart that it had come to this. I saw my mates getting fire extinguishers sprayed on them, I saw the aggression of the police, and watching it getting torn apart was just really heartbreaking.
They raided us at night time. They wore us down mentally, physically, on purpose to be able to attack. On that day, we had no weapons, and yet they were charging at us with shields, bodysuits, as though we were coming at them with bombs and guns. And so yes, there were people that retaliated, but nowhere near in the way they came at us.
It definitely didn't have to be violent, and I think if the government had the humility to listen to the people that actually pay them, then they could have ended it peacefully. But they didn't want to talk, they didn't want to listen, they just continued to ridicule, mock and demonise the people that were there. So it was their choice to make it end violently.
What I saw was the government creating this narrative about people, calling them a river of filth, and they're using the media to perpetuate that hate. Not once were these protesters running towards the police. It was only ever the police moving forward on them. And that's the side of the story that didn't get shown.
You know, and you've got to start to question, why didn't the media want to engage? There was nothing stopping them from coming down and having a cordial with us. But instead, what you saw on the mainstream media was the police officers laden with protective gear as if they were going to war. We weren't war. We weren't there to battle. We were standing with our backs to the police officers.
I think the former Prime Minister's legacy is division. First, you dehumanise them, so you give them another label. You know, they're hysterical, they're violent, they're anti-vaxxers, they're anti-mandators, but not that they're uncles, fathers, husbands, dads, cousins. You know, you dehumanise them and then you can treat them as something totally different. And that's just another tactic the media used. And it's just sad that they use it and they know they're using it and they're proud of it. That's what is a bit scary, really.
Today we're talking about the IPCA report that came out yesterday, how this report paints a picture of extreme violence on behalf of the protesters and how that picture is nothing like what I saw. And together with me is my producer Alistair Harding, who was also there as a documentary filmmaker. So, Alistair, what is your perspective of this as someone who's created an entire documentary about that protest?
Yeah, I think to me the biggest story out of all of this that I was drawn to as a filmmaker was that the people who were there, the people who were affected by it, the people who were central to it, their voices weren't heard at all. I mean, the media ignored them. The media misrepresented them. The government ignored them, and then the police just attacked them. That's how I see it. And you could argue that, those points of view, I suppose. That's no problem at all. But we've never heard from the media, ever, about why the protesters were there. And so the voices of the people who were there is central to the film We Came Here for Freedom. And throughout it, as you've heard through the clips that we've played here today, you can hear those voices and you can hear the reasons that they were there and their thoughts. And again, in this IPCA report, they're just completely absent. There are comments about them, but they're very dispassionate. They're not really seeking to understand why the protesters were there. And so that's why I think this is really interesting for us now to turn away from the report for a moment and talk to some of the people that were there. And so we arranged the interview for you with Susan and Taryn and Bex, and they, in this coming interview, they talk about that. What were your impressions of them when you spoke to them and why they were there?
I think all of these ladies were passionate about getting the mandates to stop. I think they were really dedicated, and I think they had a vision for how they saw this all play out. But rather than just taking my opinion, let's hear from the ladies themselves. So welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining me. We are on Reality Check Radio and you are all listening to the Chantelle Baker Show. Today we have three very special guests sitting here with me. They were some of the ladies that were arrested during the first when the police first tried to shut down the Parliament protest a couple of days into the protest. And so they were arrested, held in prison, and now we're going to talk about their story with the IPCA report that has just come out, pretty much saying that all of the use of force was justified, Parliament protesters are terrible people, and nobody should have been there to begin with. So if we could start with you ladies introducing yourselves and then the area that you're from.
I am Rebecca Land. I'm from Hokianga.
I'm Susan Denham and I live in Christchurch.
I'm Taryn Reid from Gisborne, East Coast.
So let's start talking about we'll talk about the protest generally a little bit later, but I think right now we should just talk about the arrest, what happened with it, what the police were like. So how did that arrest first happen? Where were you guys? What time of day was it? What was going on?
I was arrested really early, so we kind of woke up and saw the line forming. I just read on the report that it was 8 a.m. and I kind of had no idea at the time. And I think I was arrested at 10:20. Having had quite a lot of protest experience with, social justice stuff and environmental protests and that sort of thing, I had a, vague idea, but never been arrested or confronted with real police pressure. We were just sitting down and linking arms and definitely got scuffled around. But then just got kind of pulled out with unnecessary force because there was absolutely no resistance from us. I think I was hit over the head, but I don't really know where that came from. But and so a couple of female officers took me and wrenched my arms up my back, and then that was it really. I was treated pretty well compared to most people, I think.
Awesome. So it was about 8 a.m. when everyone was sitting down in the circles before people stood up?
Yeah, I think from the report was saying that they started the announcements at 8. I actually thought it was earlier, but so it all was a bit of a time warp, really.
Yeah, merges into one blob, doesn't it?
I was arrested later on in the day. I really didn't think that I was going to get arrested. I didn't think that anyone around me would get arrested because we weren't doing anything bad. We were just hanging out. And I watched my arrest on like a live feed, and I was like, oh, that's how it all happened. They had some little techniques that they were doing behind the line, and they split up our line and charged a line of them into us, and then all of a sudden I was just kind of surrounded by all these police officers just going, how did I get here? Yeah, and then they tried to take me, and they just had my shirt, and I sort of ducked down and thought that they'd let go, but they hadn't, and then when I stood back up again, they just popped me out, and I just didn't resist or anything, and the two ladies took me away.
So were people standing at that point? Was that a little bit later?
We were all just sitting there talking to the police, or standing there talking to the police and singing. Yeah.
Mm. And were your backs facing the police at that point, or were you front on?
Front on. We were all front on.
Yeah, because that was about midday, wasn't it, when people turned around, I think? Maybe it was a little bit earlier.
I don't know, but it was... I didn't know what was going on in the rest of the line. We could only sort of see what was going on around like 10 metres around us. And I thought all the arrests and everything were just happening down the other end. I think we were all facing the whole time I was there.
Mm.
I think it was like 2 p.m. maybe when I got arrested.
It was a long day, wasn't it? It was a long day, but time flew at the same time.
I felt like I was there for maybe 2 hours.
Yeah, you look down, I was like, oh my gosh, we've been live for like 4 or 5 hours. I'm like, how has that even happened? It's just so intense, and it kind of was so engrossing the whole time, because we had the live stream on one hand and then the actual camera trying to record on the other, because the other camera records in 4K. So I was trying to zoom in on every arrest in case people needed footage to use in their court cases later on. So it was quite full on.
Yeah,
and what about you? When was your arrest?
I was quite lucky. I was doing my lives as well, so I'd kind of walked up and down the police line a couple of times, and because it was so early, there was no pushing or anything from them. It was quite calm, and by the time I found my spot to sit down, again, I was quite lucky. I had an officer that I could tell didn't want to be there, and so as they would try and take their steps to push us back, I could see either way. Some of them were being quite forceful, but as I could tell, mine in front didn't want to be doing it. He was like, come on, sister, move just a little bit, he's taking these tiny baby steps, and with his hand lightly on my arm, I'm thinking, you're not good at the rest, So by the time I actually got arrested, it was more just because I was one of the sort of smaller ones left in that space, which is what they were aiming for. At first they thought they'd just be able to whip me out on my own, but they didn't realise that I had my friend, he'd tied his poncho to me, and so then they'd be dragging him along too. So it wasn't until they'd realised that it got a bit more forceful because they were trying to separate us. And again, he's like, big Maori guy, and so the guys were a lot more forceful on him and then trying to rip us apart. So that would be the only time within my rest that kind of got really full on. Otherwise, it was just sort of sitting there, kind of being rolled around as they sort of upped it each time.
Did it surprise you that the police came in with the actions that they did of trying to drag people out from behind, or did you kind of expect that they were going to do that at some point?
Well, I guess it all just comes back to logic, like tactics. From the start they just had their front line and they thought that they could just arrest people, and then that wasn't working, because then of course once we knew what they were doing, you had the protesters sticking together to hold each other in. Again, in some of my lives you can see where we're fully locked in together so that they couldn't pull us out. And so then it was like, okay, yeah, they're changing up their tactic, which was when they started cutting through to really corner us and surround us, and we were screwed.
It was kind of like a pole driver to watch from above, because I was on like a pillar quite high, so I was kind of watching down and seeing the tactics, and it's almost like they would have their line, and then their line would very slightly split, and they'd have a whole second line that was kind of set up like, the poles that they used to drive through doors. It was kind of set up like that, so they'd drive through like a big pole unit, push in between that little gap that they just created, grab someone and then drag them out really fast.
Yep.
So it was almost like watching the jaws open up, grab someone, kind of like the hungry hippo machine.
And then especially because we were near the edge, like that gap, they'd come through and really trampled across my friends, but they'd created that gap and sort of gone to the other edge so that you had a real sort of group of us in there to get all out at once. So yeah, it was pretty full on.
Do you think that if the police hadn't done that day, do you think the protest would have continued, or do you think it would have maybe fizzled out?
I think maybe it would have fizzled out for sure, because we were all kind of there and not much was happening, and we were all kind of just standing around looking at each other, listening to a few people talking on the stage. And like, okay, cool. But there was no atmosphere. There wasn't really much fun. And I'm just like, gosh, this protesting stuff is kind of a little boring. And it's like, have we already done what we were supposed to do? Is anything going to come of this? But then when they did come in, it done us a big favour, I think, because of the way the police came in and were a bit brutal and tried to do that. It woke up New Zealand, and then everyone started coming in. The funding started to flood in. The tents started to be sent in. New Zealand just stepped up and sent us everything. Manpower, food.
It definitely felt like it united a lot of people, and watching all the comments and things coming in, it really felt like people were actually, this is a real turning point, because New Zealand's always been a nation of people that were really friendly and got along and didn't really like that much confrontation. Our police officers are actually really chill, I would say, for a small nation, comparatively when we look at the States or Canada, anything like that. So I think that was a moment that did unite and shock people equally. And so then after that, it was a lot harder for them to try and like break down kind of the will and the strength of the protesters to a point where they would be able to shut it down again, because, every single weekend it would turn into some kind of like massive party, so it was very difficult for them. But how did you all meet? So you all got arrested at different times throughout the day. Did you know each other prior to that, or did you all meet once you were in holding cells? How did that work?
We actually did have a meeting, the three of us, earlier, because there was something around the toilets, and Becky is a big organiser, and she was the one to make sure that there was toilets, and yes, I just remember the three of us being around together. And also I noticed Taryn, because there was some misunderstandings at the beginning of like where people were going to be staying. It's like one lot of people were like, okay, we can't camp on Parliament. Taryn jumps up and is like, people, we are camping on Parliament. No one's going anywhere, which was great, because everyone's confused. They're like, we thought we were going to be here until they came to speak to us, which meant camping on Parliament. So it was really good that Taryn got up and started voicing her views, because it solidified it for me that I was there to stay, and everyone else too. We all knew what we were doing, and that was...
When did you hear about the protest and about people actually camping there? Like, where did that even come from? Because I didn't even know that was happening before I got to Parliament.
The convoy chat. There was just, I remember people... I only heard about the convoy the day that it rocked into Christchurch. And then I joined that. Best day of my life. And then the convoy chat, I just noticed people saying, how long are we staying? Others are like, until we achieve this. You know, we're not leaving until the mandates are finished. Or so there's lots of people supporting that. And I was like, okay, we're here for maybe a while.
Did you have any supplies going into that? Did you have
nothing.
Anything? No, cool.
I had back in my car a mattress, and I just thought maybe we'd be there for 2 or 3 days, and that people in Parliament would come out and communicate with us, and we would have succeeded something. I sort of was there for 2 or 3 days, and other people were saying stuff like, I can't get there till next weekend. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe we're here for a few weeks. And other people are like, okay, I can come the first weekend and the third weekend. And I was like, wow, people are really going to be committed to coming down when they can.
Well, that was just the big unknown. I had someone ring me and they said, is there a building for sale near there that we could house a whole lot of protesters in? And I was going, buddy, I hope that we do not need a building. But I was like, you know, but people just didn't know. I think my parents had hired a wee house around the bay for a month because they were like, we don't know how long people are going to be here for. And so it was just such a difficult thing going into that unknown. But the atmosphere that was there was really incredible. But I do remember those first few days, it was pretty quiet. People didn't really know what was going on. There was a bit of division. I think people were upset about who owned sound systems and whatnot. Just such petty things, isn't it, when you look back? But that was happening very early on, and then that quickly changed after the initial day where the police did come in with extraordinary violence towards the protesters. I know Jeanette had her ribs broken, and now the police are saying, oh, well, we can't identify the officer because he was wearing a mask. So you hear that kind of thing and you say, well, so there's all of the negative press is completely on the shoulders of the protesters. The police didn't get anything. They're never held accountable for what they did to the people, and now they get to kind of walk away going, we did such a good job, pat ourselves on the back. But what was it like for you guys once you got to prison? Let's talk through kind of the prison time, because a lot of other people signed the forms, got released straight away, and you ladies really dug your heels in on that.
I mean, the whole thing, you know, was evolving the whole time, right? You know, we didn't have a grand plan, but over that day in the cells, and I think once we were all in there, I was like, oh, you know, we could potentially use this for our advantage and really get some attention with these arrests. So that's when I started getting the women to start sharing their stories about why they were there in Wellington, and just to show how like diverse we all were, and then it kind of started going, oh yeah, okay. And then of course I got in touch with Sue Gray, and she was like, yeah, you guys being in there is really getting attention. So that was like, and I was feeding that back to the group, and they're like, okay, we could use this, and so I guess it whittled down over the day to overnight, 20 of us overnight or something.
Yeah, quite a few overnight.
And then
that wanted to stay in.
Yeah, and I mean, most of the women were like, oh, I so want to stay, but for, you know, legitimate reasons had to go. Or just didn't feel up to it. So that's totally understandable. They were all amazing. And all the guys too, you know, we could hear the guys, and it was an amazing atmosphere in there. And then, by the next morning, most of the so like, I don't know, when it got down to us 7, maybe halfway through that
just
second day.
The second day.
Yeah, because so the whole second day was taken up with them trying to get us in front of this video link with the judge. And they brought us, like, over that night, random times in the night, they'd take us in, trying to get us to do fingerprints, offering again, sign this and we'll let you go sort of thing, and all these weird deals and all this weird variation between all of us. Some of us were offered food, some of us weren't, some of us were this, some of us put in little cells on their own for a little while and brought back, and it was super, super weird. And and then the next morning we asked, they kept letting me actually out to talk to everyone, to kind of like fill them in, because I'd talked to Sue and then I talked to someone else, blah, blah. And then we all got together again the next morning, which was probably quite nice of them, I suppose. I don't know if that might have been something to do with the fact that they were holding us longer than they were allowed. And by bringing us all back together, that gave them some sort of leeway again.
Yeah, that's what we'd heard.
Holding cell,
later.
yeah. If they had a separate, then it was a certain amount of hours. But if we were together, anyway, don't quite know. But so then it was like, okay, well, I guess we still hadn't fully galvanised by then until we're not signing it. And then they're like, okay, well, if you don't sign, you're going to go to prison. And then by the end of that day, they'd taken us up to the courthouse because they couldn't get the video link working.
So what was it that they wanted you to sign? Was it like some kind of release form saying I did these things?
Yeah, the willful trespass, the charge. So the charge sheet of willful trespass and the bail conditions of you're not allowed to go back to Parliament.
And that's what we'd sort of discussed between us on that second day. I'd said, it's fine. I'd already lost everything, my job. I didn't have anything to go back to. And then that was sort of the discussion based on some of the ladies that couldn't go through because of their children. A couple of the ladies were unsure based on what their husbands had to say. One lady didn't think her husband would agree, but once she'd got that phone call, she was like, I'm coming too. And so then that was it. It was like once we'd sort of decided, okay, yeah, that's us. And that's how we'd sort of got to our 7. And so it was in that day that it sort of filtered out. And then they were mucking around to get the 7 of us in front of the judge. The camera link kept not working. Like, we didn't know. We'd never been in this situation before. And of course, again, you had officers that were like, this shouldn't be happening to you guys. Like, they could tell looking at us. We're like, we've never been arrested. We don't know what's going on. What's next? And like, they were just walking around a bit dumbfounded too. Like, they're like, they were trying to offer us anything that they had because all we were getting was noodles. And then by the time they changed it up to take us to the courthouse, that's when it had fizzled down to us 7. Us saying that we're not signing that, we haven't done anything wrong, we're not prepared to be involved in the system, and that's when it resulted to you're going to jail.
So how long were you held in jail before you were released, and what were the conditions of you all being released?
We were 2 days in the prison cells and then 3 days in Arohata, women's prison. And they took us into, on our 3rd day, they took us back in to go up against the judge, and they tried to get us to sign bail again. They also tried to say, all right, well, you don't have any bail conditions, but you still have to sign this. And we were like, no, we're not signing anything because we don't agree with anything. So we're not recognising it, so we're not signing it. So they were really stumped because there were 6 of us that had given our details and the 7th one hadn't, and we were all going to band together. If they were only going to let us 6 out and not the 7th that hadn't given any of her details, then we were like, nah, we're staying. And they knew this. And so they were like, well, they couldn't really hold us, I guess.
And so it wasn't until the Monday when they put us up in front of the judge again, and I think it was only maybe 2 or 3 of us had gone through before they realised again, okay, these ladies are sticking to it. Like, in my opinion, I honestly think they just threw us in there for the weekend to try and scare us and we'd run out on Monday. Whereas, again, when we came up in front, they tried sort of just different things with the legal aid. Like, the legal aid told me, oh, yeah, you don't want anything by your name. I was like, no, I haven't done anything. I'm not doing anything. He's, oh, okay, cool. And then he rushed it through and then went through in the courts to plead guilty. And I'm like, no, we're not guilty. We're not doing anything. We're not. And so then that changed it again because he's like, oh, but if you just plead guilty and then go through, then we can get through the system and then you can get out of here. And it was like emphasising we've got nothing else out there. Like, we're here for a reason. Going to jail doesn't scare us. That's scary, but and so then again they sort of realised, oh yeah, we're sticking together. When we got kicked out, it wasn't that they released us on bail. So it was just like, oh, you can go.
They also kind of said that it didn't matter in the end whether we signed or not, which was really interesting because they said whether you'll sign or not, you still have a warrant out for your arrest. If you do not turn up to your court date, we can arrest you again. So we're like, oh.
Which was ridiculous again, because then when we turned up to our court dates together, I think it was like 2 days later or whatnot, they then wouldn't let us into the courthouse. So it's like, so you've told us there's a warrant out for arrest if we don't turn up. We're here and you're not going to let us in.
Is that because of COVID? Or? Yeah.
Because they're like, they're like, are you vaccinated? We're like, no. Why are we here? And then they're like, oh, will you have a test? We're like, no. Mask, all of that stuff. So then we were left out standing on the road.
So what happened? Did anything happen after that, or did it just fizzle out?
Well, we had Elena,
Yeah.
a lady that was studying law, come in. She was amazing. She got almost everybody off all their bail charges because of us, because we got released with no bail. It then meant that everyone else should be under the same ruling, and she got most of the other 120 off all their bail conditions on that Thursday as well. So really amazing that she jumped on board there and sorted that out for everyone, because it meant everyone could go back to Parliament without being arrested again.
So that makes sense, because I did wonder how everyone could go back without being arrested, and that's fascinating. Go Elena.
Yeah.
Stranger Elena, go you.
Yeah.
Someone that was just studying law got 100 of them off. Wow.
Yeah, it was really cool.
That's awesome. I was interested in what you said before about everyone being there for their own reasons. So if we can just go around and say, why were you at the protest? What did it mean to you?
I had been mandated out of my job November prior. I was with adult intellectual disabilities, and at the time I kind of thought it's just a job, I'm fine, I've got the rest of my life. But it wasn't until it actually started affecting my mental health, like not being able to go to the gym, then realising that I wouldn't be able to participate in the triathlon events that I was all geared up to go. And then, I just heard about it. I was like, oh, well, I'm off. I'm coming too.
It's happening.
Yeah.
I wasn't really there for personal reasons. I was actually super stoked to be mandated. I was like, summer, yeah. And I'm a good saver, so I was financially able to be able to take a big holiday without the stress of the brain. I was super stoked actually that I didn't have to live and conform and do the societal things. But I was at an unvaxxed netball game with other friends that were either vaccinated because they were forced to be vaccinated, or otherwise forced as in like they couldn't afford to lose their jobs.
Bullied into it. Yeah.
And other ones that had just lost their jobs and stuff like that. And they had children. They couldn't get on the convoy, but they were like, wow, you don't have children. I had the freedom to be able to get on that convoy. And I was confused. I was like, I actually am really stoked that I don't have to go to work right now. What am I doing on this convoy? But yeah, I'm so stoked that I'd done it for the other people that couldn't make it. But my biggest reason probably was more for small businesses. It wasn't just the vaccines for me. It was like all the lockdowns and, like our country's going through recession. Everyone's going through financial hardship, and everyone was convinced that they were getting these free vaccines or free money from the government every time we went into lockdown. Auckland was in lockdown for a long time. All this free money for 2/3 of the population, it's got to come from somewhere, And I was just like, gosh, this is not good. It's not sustainable. And considering, the people that were really affected badly by this COVID virus were all like 70 or 80 plus. There was a few younger people, and I've talked to nurses that work in hospitals. They're saying most of them had huge underlying issues that would have died from the flu anyway. And
And just to validate that as well, I think the average comorbidities for a COVID death, the average age of death was around 80 to 82, which is the average age of life, and the average comorbidities was 4.
Wow, yeah. Yeah, and so I just thought that all this money being spent and all these lockdowns, all these people being locked away, and that was affecting mental health, and there was a lot more suicides and stuff like that. And, like not giving us the choice, do you all want to be in lockdown? Do you all want to have a vaccine? I'm all for supporting anyone with their choices. If you want to go into your own lockdown, go into your own lockdown, cool. But all these other businesses that all had to shut their door every time that they had a lockdown, there was more and more businesses being shut down permanently. And if you lose your business, you lose your house. If you lose your house, half the time you might even lose your family. Who knows? And loads of people did lose their families just over vax status. And so mainly that was why I was there. Once again, I was super lucky. My family was very supportive of me. I didn't lose any family members, maybe 3 friends in my life maybe that are no longer in my life. But yeah.
I had kind of been involved in the whole thing from the get-go. You could see it was quite obvious. My family's always been quite aware of government overreach and stuff, so it was really obvious continuum of everything that had been happening. But I I started the Voices for Freedom group up in Hokianga, Freedom group up there, and so and had supported a lot of my friends who were teachers and nurses when they were getting threatened with losing their job or being forced into taking this thing they didn't want to take into their bodies. And so for me, it was just like, that whole notion of government's a mandate, the ability of a government to mandate is just something that actually shouldn't be there, because at the end of the day, if you don't have a freedom to choose, then we don't live in a democracy. So for me, it was on that level, kind of vax issue or not. It's the notion of choice and where. What's the role of government? Is it a moral police, or is it facilitation of resources and all of that sort of thing? So I was there to represent a lot of people up north. Through that group that we'd started up there, it was really, really obvious that we were far from alone. And then that first day on the convoy, I realised that we're like the thousands of people just between my tiny home in Hokianga and Whangarei, which is when I just finally decided, oh my God, okay, I'm going. I have to go. This is it. It's finally it. Just so that's like a 2-hour drive, and there were thousands and thousands of people lining the roads in the middle of nowhere sometimes. So I had nothing with me. I just decided to kind of go and support it for the day, because I'd heard about it like 2 days before. And just had like a summer dress on, because it was a roasting hot day that day, and went with nothing. No extra clothes, no sleeve bag, no nothing. I was like, okay, this is happening. And it was awesome. And that whole trip down was just like crazy. One of the most amazing experiences of my life. And it was evolving the whole way, like being, I was on the Voices for Freedom chat, when they started kind of taking over the coordination of it all, because things had got a little bit political with the people who originally kind of came up with the idea, and there was a lot going on. So that's how I ended up organising toilets by the time I got to Wellington. And I was definitely there on that level of, this is just not appropriate behaviour for a government to be doing.
Absolutely, absolute overreach. And it's interesting now, because they say, but it was never mandatory. It was a mandate, but it wasn't mandatory. So you weren't forced into it. You were just bullied and coerced into it, and they're totally different things.
It was really, because we had a choice. Is what they say.
So they brought out the Health and Disability Act, right? And in every single item on that list was just ignored. Like that little booklet that's in every healthcare clinic, every workplace. Those rights. Out the door.
Everything and nothing had meaning the minute they didn't want it to have any meaning.
Right.
That's the
so
reality.
you just change the law. The ability to change a law too, and with that rate. When that's happening, that's not democracy. Yeah.
It's dangerous. Let's get into some of the positive stuff that you guys remember from the protest. What was your highlight? What was your one pinnacle? You sat there and you thought, man, I'm actually really loving this. Or what was a beautiful moment between people?
Mine was probably on the second day, and we're all kind of confused, all mulling around, not really sure what was going on. And, there was some, just some conversations getting heated between people, and then mostly towards the people up on the Parliament that were recording us and stuff like that. And also just around who was going to be controlling the speakers for the day, because there wasn't really anyone in charge. And so, people were starting to get a little bit antsy, and some at each other. And then Machu got up and started singing and started calming everybody down. And I was just like, wow, I just called him our saviour, our angel from then on. I was just like, oh my God. It was a really magic moment to watch him unite all these people. I mean, there's a lot of unhappy people there that have lost their their lives, their jobs, everything. Some of them were vaccinated, force vaccinated, some of them were vax-injured. And for him to get up there and unite all these different people, like we had so many people in different walks of life were affected by this, and so we had all different walks of life there. From, there's mention of the homeless people, and then there's mention of like the business people all the way through. And he united us, and throughout the whole 3 weeks of being there, the unity between everybody. There was no pecking order. Everyone was equal. All different types of races, religions, age groups. We were all friends with each other.
It was the most diverse place.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to talk about diversity and inclusion, far out. You couldn't pick a much more diverse bunch of people than everybody that was at that protest. And I think
small part of land.
Yeah, a tiny part of land that held a lot of different opinions and people. But that was what was so cool about it as well, is that that's such a rarity to occur. Even at festivals, you often have certain ages and demographics and things like that, yet this was such a random, sporadic group of people. And I think the one thing I find interesting is they like to talk about the dangers of fascism and cult-like thinking, but everyone that was at that protest is about individualism, and that's why they couldn't find a leader, because everyone wanted to be there for themselves. They didn't want to be led by anyone. They wanted to be there by themselves. They had individual groups. Everyone was focused on what it meant to be there for them, not even necessarily the collective. It's just for themselves. They were there for them. And then you look at real cult-like behaviour, and it's everyone has to do this for the collective. So you need to listen to the leader, potentially the one that came on at TV, and you need to follow the collective because that's for the greater good. So it's interesting, I think, the terminology of when they look back on the protest and some of the media that comes out about it. Bex, what was your highlight?
It was really the convoy. By the time I arrived in Wellington, I was already like, this is it. Oh my God. Thank God. Like, we're not alone. I knew we weren't alone, and it was just proof, like seeing those overpasses all through Auckland and the whole way down the country was like packed. It was like, here we are, here's New Zealand. And again, the diversity of people all along the roadside. Getting in that paddy wagon with a bunch of women who were just like kind of just grinning at each other going, yeah, who cares? That was pretty cool. Dancing on the wall. Seeing a tiny little old woman having a hug with this giant gang member, or a businessman talking to a
Hare Krishna
or a hippie kid with a little, whatever. It was so beautiful seeing those interactions, and people would get into these intense conversations, not even introduce themselves. That didn't matter anymore. It was just like straight into like, oh my God, I just lost my mum because she won't talk to me anymore, or whatever. Like, I wasn't able to go to my father's funeral. Those sorts of level, that depth of connection, and that whole diversity. Like when Jacinda came, I think she said, "This is not representative of New Zealand." And I got up on the first day and I said, "If this isn't representative, then I don't know what is." Yeah,
that's really powerful. It was
crazy. Yeah, and just seeing the generosity, like radical generosity, is what makes this country go around. Like it could so easily. Like that's what we saw was, we've actually got everything we need here. We don't need a government, and we don't need all this fear. We've got all the skills and the resources and we could just make it happen.
Yeah, like when Trevor Mallard turned the sprinklers on all the protesters in the middle of this torrential downpour. I don't know if it was like some kind of like a hurricane or something like that. It was some big dramatic event that they were using, and so people got really upset being in the rain, and then next minute it just changed. It went from being like, oh no, we're covered, to being like, awesome. Farmers are bringing in hay bales. They're protecting the grass because an old man, I think, slipped and broke his ankle or his wrist. So then they wanted to look after the grass, and they put hay bales down everywhere, and then some plumbers were starting to redirect water, and then it got turned into this water party. People were just loving it, and there's amazing photos of these people standing protesting on one of the walls and are standing up at Parliament, against Parliament, holding up their Kiwi flags. And I just thought, man, it was powerful, because it really showed people that no matter what, we want to stand here until we get listened to. And I think that's kind of the fundamental core of it all. People just really wanted to be heard. What was your highlight?
Mine would have been the convoy as well. Coming from a smaller town, it was all sort of very censored. Like, you know, we kind of knew who was on what side, but then you'd kind of keep the peace and not overly discuss it. We had our groups that we'd kind of started getting together, but the majority of the people in those groups I'd sort of only just met around all of this. And so because I'd only found out about the convoy like the day before, I think, and messaged my friend, I was like, do you have room? I'm coming. It wasn't until we'd got to Napier that night and that they were going to be coming through the next day. It was pouring down in rain. We're in like their half-done horse cart, like, you know, she'd just started with the bed and partial kitchen. There was no bathroom in it, you know, but there's us all piled in waiting. And when we arrived at the spot, like, there was no one else. We were thinking, okay, is this really happening? We were starting to doubt. And then, yeah, like once the sort of light of the day started coming up, people saw their big horse truck, and because we'd decorated it, covered it in writing, people just assumed that we were in charge there, and so they just started flocking in with like massive amounts of food. Like, I can't be seen here, I've got a business to protect, but I'll leave all of this food donations. We're like, oh, okay, yeah. And then it was, you know, tents and gazebos and whatnot. We're like, oh, okay, so it was already the build-up of all the generosity there. And as you said, you know, complete strangers. You know, we're going through it too, we don't agree. And as well as that, the amount of people that were there that were vaccinated but in support of pro-choice as well. You know, that's what was important to me. It's like, we don't need to judge each other on our viewpoints. And so the amount of people that would stand there with a sign, I'm vaxxed, I'm pro-choice, you know, all of that. And then, yeah, once the convoy came through in Napier, I was like recording, standing there in tears in the pouring rain with all these people, because even though we'd had semi-supportive groups back home, you're just still feeling so isolated and alone. You know, you're like questioning everything. I've done the supposed right thing. I was contributing to the community. I'm doing great things, and I've just been thrown to the dogs. So that was the realization of, I'm not alone, and there's a whole lot more. And so then as we progressed through each township, as you said, like people standing out in the middle of nowhere. They didn't know when we were coming through for sure, but they knew we were coming, standing there, holding their kids. You're doing this for my kids. That was like really sort of the main thing. My kids, thank you for my kids. And then even, I think once we got to Palmerston was like the real huge. There was just people everywhere, and there was just copious amounts of food. And then we sort of got to see all together exactly how much of us, because we were there in the subdivision, they ran out of room in the subdivision, they had to find more room, and we're just like, yeah, we got this. I don't know where this is going, but we got this, you know, this is something. And I think that was a big thing for me personally, after just, yeah, feeling like the whole rest of my life had been sort of tipped upside down. Yeah, and then having those discussions, you know, a lot of people were just very much in the same boat.
There's a lot of talk around the protesters and what they should and shouldn't have done, and language that was used and signs that were made. How do you look back and see some of like the messaging that was written about, you know, Jacinda being killed and things like that? How do you guys perceive any of that?
In my opinion, it's always easy to look back and go, what if, woulda, coulda, shoulda. Like in any situation, positive, there's always going to be stuff that you can critique. And then again, we also need to remember there's always going to be extremes. No matter what discussion or interest or whatever, you're always going to butt heads with someone, oh, you're a bit too far in for me, or, you know, and that's going to happen. And at the end of the day, there were a lot of hurt, distraught people just from that last couple of years, let alone people that have been well aware of all of this stuff for a long time. So that wasn't just a matter of, oh, you know, you tripped over and stubbed your toe. Whoa. Like some people, it has ripped them apart. And so at the same time, again, like anything is healthy because it needs to come out. It's not always going to be a great way of coming out, but it comes out to bring awareness. And that's what we needed, and that's what happened. And so from then on out, it's like made people aware, oh, actually, I don't want to live my life like that. In like my version personally, it's decided, oh yeah, okay, those friends aren't really my friends. That's fine. You know, I want to make these choices. Do I want to be in the system? So it's just like sort of silver linings of moving forward, because if anything, she brought a whole bunch of diverse people out of the woodworks to clump together like so.
Yeah.
And
And in a lot of situations, whenever there's like someone out there or a group of people out there and they're causing huge drama or they're hurting people, like I've always stood by the saying, hurt people, and considering how much a lot of these people at Parliament, their lives were really, really hurt, they'd lost a lot. I think that those few little signs or those few people that were lashing out, absolutely nothing compared to how hurt most people that were at Parliament actually were. I feel like it was, sure, there was some out there lash outs, but in comparison to how hurt all the protesters, or a lot of the protesters' lives have been, and even the protesters that weren't there, people that were supporting from afar, in comparison to how hurt the government and their choices have hurt people, I think that those few things minuscule.
I mean, you had medical professionals openly saying they didn't want to treat vaccinated people, saying that they think unvaccinated people, that they think unvaccinated people should die. So when you've got a real threat versus someone that's made a sign,
yeah, especially considering that it was such a few. The few of those more really angry signs were like a speck in this ocean of like peace and love, handing flowers to the cops, drawing beautiful rainbows and aroha, and kids doing beautiful pastel drawings all over the place, expressing creativity and music and dancing and hugs and even well wishes to the parliamentarians, because people recognised that it was so much bigger than just our, the faces, Jacinda being the face of a way, way bigger picture, and knowing it was an institutional thing, and even an admission from a lot of people there that in some ways we've created this situation ourselves by taking the easy route with allowing governments to get into a position where they can do things like mandate. We've allowed that in many ways. It's not big baddies necessarily, they only take an opportunity.
It's all part of the game, and they played it well.
I mean, I just think that at the end of the day, there's beautiful connections and bonds and friendships that have been made, like what you ladies share, that will run far further than any protest. And it's lifelong friendships that people did make coming through that battle zone of those few years, where they really felt like it was a psychological war against people that were saying to the government, no, you're pushing me too far and this is my line and I'm not going to accept being exiled from society. Well, ladies, thank you so much. I've so enjoyed chatting to you, and I think you're all very, very strong women. So thank you for joining us on the Chantelle Show here at RCR. Let's wrap up this very interesting show, and I hope you found a lot of value in our bits and pieces and breaking down this IPCA report, because it's a long document, it's a lot to go through, but we think there are numerous points here which the general public need to understand about this report. The result of this justifies all of the police actions. There's no discussion on why the protesters were there, what escalated it, what brought them to that situation. There's no talk of using democracy or discussion to solve the problem. Apparently it's acceptable to use violent force as long as a parliamentary member decides not to have a conversation with the public. Instead, the whole conversation is centred around providing the police with more equipment and changing laws that would enable the use of further force in the future. We've seen this exemplified by recently bringing over police from Hong Kong to train our police about how to handle protesters. In Hong Kong, it's been taken over by the Chinese Communist Party, and they use force such as firearms on their protesters because they don't want you to protest. So if that's the kind of training our police are getting, what is this going to mean for the future of democracy here in New Zealand? Is this really the New Zealand that we want? And Alistair, I'd like your thoughts on this as someone who's lived in Singapore for a number of years. How do you see the Chinese training of our police panning out in the future?
Yeah, as you say, I lived in Singapore for almost 20 years. And while they're not Chinese territory, they do have very similar sorts of laws and so on. But they are also known as a democracy. And this is the warning that I'd like to share with New Zealanders as we think about this, because this police report its solution to all of this is not democracy, it's not discussion and dialogue. It's we need more laws so that we can be more violent, I suppose, or use more force quicker. That's what their solution is from all of this, from my reading. To me, when I read through that and the justifications for the use of force, and then the requests, I suppose, for more laws, it just reminds me of my time in Singapore. Now, in Singapore, I used to work one block away from a park. It was called Speaker's Corner, and it had a little concrete block where a speaker could stand up on and speak to the masses. And I suppose it was a nod and an echo of Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park and many other Speaker's Corners around the world. And there's one at Albert Park as well, I seem to recall, up in Auckland, where the Posey Parker thing happened recently. But anyway, this Speaker's Corner is really interesting because there's also a police station there. And this is what more laws about freedom of speech and protest in New Zealand leads to. If you want to make a speech at Speaker's Corner in Singapore, you have to go to the police station and you have to apply for a permit so that you can go and stand up on that concrete block and give a speech. And part of that is you have to give the contents of your speech. You have to write it out and you have to give it to the police, and the police can edit it if they like, and they can tell you, no, you can't say this and you can say that. And then you have to get up on that block and you have to read that speech word for word. So every protest that happens in Singapore is completely controlled by the government. Now, is that what we want in New Zealand? Because that's what's going to happen if we keep on introducing more and more laws like this report is asking. And that's my warning for New Zealanders, that, you know, you can say that I believe in freedom of speech, but only to a point, and, you know, we have to be reasonable and all of that. But the point of protest is that it is uncomfortable for people. And they can talk all they like about how the people of Wellington were inconvenienced by this protest. That's fine. But the people who were there protesting had been inconvenienced in a far greater fashion, and that's why they were there. So if we're going to shut down voices, if we're going to include more legislation to try and shut down voices, just be aware that that's what's going to happen in the end. You're not going to have a voice, or your voice will be allowed, but only if it's approved. And I think that's a really stark warning for all of us here in New Zealand.
This brings me to my final thoughts. What New Zealand do we want? Do we want a New Zealand with more choice, or do we want a New Zealand with more control? They say they need to change legislation to enable police in the future to act more aggressively against protesters. But this protest happened because of the biggest violation of human rights in New Zealand's history that we have seen in the last 50 years. So if changing legislation means that the government can enact whatever they want at any point, and if we start to rise up and if anyone starts to try and stop them, we're going to be met with brutal force, is that the New Zealand that we need? Is that the New Zealand that police officers really want? Or do we want a New Zealand where Parliament actually has to come to the party, speak with citizens, and use democracy to find resolution? Because from my end, I think people need to get serious about getting out and voting and deciding what kind of future they want for their country. Because this isn't the New Zealand that I recognise. This isn't the New Zealand that many people recognise. It's divided, it's hateful, it's nasty. People aren't allowed opinions that don't agree with the media. And people are getting slandered left, right and centre for sharing any view that this current government deems is inappropriate. I know the New Zealand that I want. I want the New Zealand that cares about people. I want the New Zealand where you can have conversations and disagree and it's okay. I want the New Zealand that focuses on laughing and chatting and hanging out rather than abusing people. I want a New Zealand that realises we don't need the government in every single part of our lives. They didn't used to be there. Let's go back to the old New Zealand, the good New Zealand, the New Zealand where you were friends with everybody and we didn't talk endlessly about politics because we had to. It was a side conversation here or there. That's my final thoughts. Have a great weekend, everybody. I so appreciate you tuning in and then sharing our replays later on. It's really wonderful to see the response that we've been getting here at RCR. You've been listening to The Chantelle Baker Show with my producer, Alistair Harding. This is Reality Check Radio.